Oh, it's good evening. Pooh Bear, get your butt away from the camera. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Oh, for a second I was like, Ladybuggy? Lady Buggle? Or is it Ladybuggy? Or is it Ladybug and I'm just butchering it? I know, Hoobie, you're a good boy. You're a good boy. I hope everyone's... Oh, okay. Gotcha. Well, I hope everyone's Friday has been great so far. And depending on where you are in the world, this is either evening time or afternoon time. So good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. Darling, would you mind shut the door for me a little bit? Thank you. That's my husband, everybody. He's the great door shutter. Ishmael, hello, good evening. Saturday. Oh. Fine. Good morning. All right. So like normal, we'll give it till about 5 after. And for those of you who are brand new, welcome. And for those of you who are rejoining us, welcome back. We will be reading this evening from Cleopatra's Daughter. We are at this point halfway through the story, but if you are interested in catching up, I will have all of the previous reads recorded on my YouTube page. And I've got them listed in sequential order so you don't have to try and figure out like which video is which. So if you want to catch up, or if you've missed a section, or you just want to listen to the sultry sound of my voice again, visit my YouTube page and check out my readings of Cleopatra's Daughter. You've been dying to use that one for weeks. Well, there you go. Glad we could assist in that. Does anyone have any fun plans for the weekend? Hello, 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 everyone. I'm so glad you guys could have made it this evening or this morning, depending on where you are. So we'll give it till about 8:05. But for now, it's going to be, like the last few times, it's going to be really hard to give like the Reader's Digest of what's going on in this story right now, because there's like literal constant action in this story. It's like as soon as one crisis is over, there's like another one waiting in the wings. But the best I'll give is we are following along with the children of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Originally it was 3. Now we're down to 2. So it's the 2 eldest children, Alexander Helios, who is the son, and Cleopatra Selene, who is the daughter. So, Cleopatra's daughter. But, so they have been taken captive by the Roman Caesar Octavian after he has defeated their parents in Egypt and has basically annexed Egypt as a new part of Rome, an extension of the Roman Empire. So the kids are now living with Octavian's sister, Octavia. The Romans were really original with their names. And so they are technically prisoners, but they're also royalty. So, all things considered, they're living a pretty good life in Rome. But they have learned very, very quickly that if they are to adulthood, or to at least try to, they need to make themselves exceptionally useful to Caesar. Or at least show that they're not a threat. Because we've already seen several examples in the story so far where Caesar has absolutely no problem eliminating you. No questions asked. Like if you misstep, you misspeak, you're gone. And so these two kids are trying desperately to stay alive in a foreign land, surrounded by enemies, and they've made a few friends along the way, true, but, again, at the end of the day, they're still strangers in a strange land, and they're trying really hard to figure out their place in this new society and this new life that they find themselves thrust in, really. So, the most recent reading, we've basically we have learned that Cleopatra Selene, who is just going by Selene, is very gifted with drawing and wants to be an architect. And so she's actually been taken under apprenticeship by a master architect, and so we'll see if maybe that is how Selene is going to keep herself useful and non-threatening to Caesar. We have yet to see what her brother, outside of horses, he's astute with horses and horse behavior. So who knows? Maybe he'll become a professional charioteer or something, horse breeder. I don't know. We'll see. But hello, dear friend. It is nice to meet you too. Julie. Hell yeah, brother. All right. So 805. For anyone who has the book, at the moment, we are on chapter 9. That's page 190. So here we go. Oh, and just in case, there's some Latin in here, obviously, so I may screw it up. I'm trying real hard not to. So just be kind with me. So here we go. Oh, and by the way, the kids just witnessed an assassination attempt on Caesar's life, but Selene actually saved Octavian's life. So there we go. Forgot to mention that important detail. Outside, soldiers surrounded Octavia's villa, and there was no house on the Palatine that wasn't under guard in case the assassin should reappear. As we entered the villa, Alexander and Marcellus spoke in hurried whispers about the assassination attempt. Then Octavia stopped suddenly. "Where is Gallia?" "I saw her with Magister Varius at the bottom of the hill," Antonia replied. "And what was she doing with him?" "Talking. I don't think she expected us back so soon." I looked at Octavia and saw the lines deepen between her brows. Perhaps Gallia wasn't adept at writing Latin, but Magister Varius certainly was. What if they were writing the Acta together? Varius knew what it was like to be a slave. He was a freedman himself, though he never talked about his childhood with us in the Ludus. Marcellus looked from me to his mother. "What is it?" "Nothing," she said sternly, dismissing us with a wave. "Go to your chambers." But as I moved to go, she held me back with her hand. She waited until everyone had left before saying, "You saved my brother tonight." "I didn't do anything. It was Juba." "But you saw it first." Her eyes searched mine in the torchlit atrium. "How did you know?" "I saw him knock the arrow, then his muscles tensed like he would really set it free." Octavia nodded, and her eyes filled with tears. "Why?" I knew what she was asking. Why had I called Octavian's name when his assassination could have meant my freedom? What had changed between the triumph and today? I pressed my lips together and considered my answer before speaking. "Because he is our future," I said carefully, and there was nothing I needed to explain. Without him, who knew what would happen to Alexander and me? And if another senator made himself Caesar, what would become of Octavia? Who would feed the poor and bring clothes to the Suburra? There would be more bloodshed, more civil war, and the abandoned infants beneath the Columna Lactaria would be food for Rome's dogs. "I am thankful to the gods for you, Selene." I flushed. "Will you do an errand for me?" "Of course." She took out a key and unlocked the doors to the library. The room was still unbearably warm, heavy with the scents of leather and papyrus. Moonlight silvered the marble busts on the shelves, and Octavia went to one of these statues and took it down. She studied the face by the light of a distant torch. The subject was a handsome man, with a strong jaw and a heavily curled beard. I thought it might be a statue of Zeus, but Octavia said quietly, "This is Juba's father. I should have given the statue to Juba years ago, but I didn't. Tonight, Juba saved my brother's life. I want you to take this to him." Give me a second. A cat's held prisoner in the room. All right, Hooby. And don't you beg to get back in here. Oh. Sorry about that. Oh, yeah. Hey, Miss Debbie, if you're here, give a holler. Good eyes, Julie. My heart sank. I would have happily gone anywhere in Rome, but why did it have to be to Juba's villa? There were 100 slaves who might have delivered this gift for her, even Gallia, once she returned, and I wondered why Octavia was choosing me. She placed the marble bust in my arms, and because it was smaller than all of the others, it wasn't heavy. She guided me to the door. Although it was dark, the road was lit by hundreds of torches as soldiers patrolled up and down the hill. When I hesitated, she explained, "My brother's men are everywhere. The Palatine is safe." A few of the soldiers nodded in my direction, and I recognized some of them as the guards who followed us to the Ludus and back every morning. When I knocked on the door of Juba's villa, the slave who answered glared down at me. He was an older man, with thick hair that had completely silvered, and his face was distinguished. "Yes," he demanded. "I have come with a gift. Dominus does not wish to see anyone right now." "But I come from Octavia." I craned my neck to see inside, and when I tried to step around him, he moved to block my entry. "No one enters this house tonight." "I am coming from Octavia with a bust of Juba's father. What's the matter with you?" Suddenly, Juba appeared behind him, and the man shook his head in frustration. "She will not listen, Domine." "I'm not surprised, Sergius. She rarely listens to anyone," Juba replied. Sergius pursed his lips, as if he was personally offended by this, and I purposefully stepped around him. "I have come with a gift." I raised my chin. "So I see. And who am I to thank for this?" Juba asked, taking the bust of his father and passing it carelessly to Sergius. "Octavia," I said, "and she did not give this lightly. Aren't you even going to look at it?" "I know what it is. A marble of Juba the First, King of Numidia." "And aren't you grateful to have a portrait of your father?" Juba smiled. "Exceptionally grateful. Please relay all of the thanks you so clearly feel on my behalf." He motioned to the slave to shut the door, but as he stepped away, I looked across the atrium, and through the open doors of the library I could see tables upon tables covered in scrolls. "What are those?" I whispered. Juba looked behind him, and I was sure I saw his face grow a little pale. I stepped inside, and this time neither man made to block my way. "Perhaps you aren't thankful because you have something to hide." "Nonsense," Sergius said angrily, but Juba raised his brows. "Wait. Let's hear what she thinks I'm hiding." The two men looked down at me. One was a prince, the other a slave, but both of them were larger, much more powerful than I. "Nothing," I said hastily, but Juba held out his arm so that I couldn't move, and his black eyes held mine in a piercing glare. "You looked into my library and announced that I was hiding something. Sergius, why don't you show the princess inside?" Sergius sighed audibly, then took my arm and guided me across the atrium. In the library, the tables were filled with scrolls, just as I had seen, but on every table was a different colored map. "Dominus is writing a history of the world," he said. "Are you happy now?" Juba stood behind me, and I could feel his eyes boring into my back. "There it is, all of my secrets laid out before you. What's the matter, Celine? Were you expecting something else?" "Not at all," I lied, and my gaze fell upon a map of Egypt. "I'm simply wondering why you've added a temple next to the Theater of Alexandria when there isn't any," I said smugly. But Juba smiled. Perhaps there wasn't one before, but there's going to be one now. I glanced back at the map. Next to the theater, I cried. That is Caesar's wish. Now, if you'll excuse me, he said, I have secrets to attend to. When I returned to the villa, I didn't see Octavia, but Marcellus and Alexander rose from their chairs as soon as I entered my chamber. I was surprised to see they were both still up. "Where have you been?" Alexander exclaimed, and the oil lamps flickered in his wake. "Octavia wanted me to deliver a statue." "To Juba?" Marcellus guessed. "She's been meaning to give him his father's bust for years, but she couldn't part with it. It's a very rare statue, by a sculptor who made very few pieces in his life." "And it belonged to Juba?" Marcellus nodded. "He was brought to Rome when he was 2 or 3, so up until then I suppose it was his." "But why would Octavia send you?" Alexander asked. "I don't know," I said defensively, sitting down on my couch and opening my book to an empty page. "Perhaps it was a punishment." Marcellus laughed. "After tonight? I doubt it." "Why? Was he in a foul mood?" "Isn't he always? He was working on his history of the world." "He wants to create a complete history of every kingdom," Marcellus explained. "Chart their lands, record their languages, study their people. Perhaps she sent you because she thought it would mean more." I drew up my knees and blushed at the thought of what I'd been willing to believe, that Juba was the Red Eagle. Everything belongs to Caesar, he had told me. Especially him. He would be the last person on the Palatine to betray Rome. Even Agrippa would defy Octavian before Juba would. But I didn't want to think about him any more. While Marcellus and Alexander whispered over candlelight about what had happened in the theater, I took out my ink and stylus and sketched a 2-storied building instead. I added frescoed walls and mosaic flooring, and enough rooms to shelter more than 300 children. When Marcellus stood up to go, he leaned over my shoulder. "What are you drawing?" "A building." "May I see?" I held out my sketch. From the outside, it was just like any other building, but the images I had drawn for the chambers inside should have made it clear what it was supposed to be. "An inn?" he asked uncertainly. "But why would an inn need so many beds?" Alexander peered over his shoulder and asked, "Is it for the foundlings?" I took my sketch from Marcellus's hands. "They can't just be left beneath the columna lactaria. Think of how many must die of exposure. It's a terrible practice." "It is," Marcellus nodded, "but how would it help to shelter them in a building?" "Adoptions could be arranged." "And the ones who aren't being adopted?" he asked. "Then they can be given to the temples and raised as akoluthoi." Marcellus frowned. "Helpers," my brother said. "And eventually priests and priestesses," I added. Marcellus studied me, and the tenderness in his eyes made my heart beat faster. "It's a wonderful idea, Celine. And if I ever become Caesar, I will see that it's done." "Really?" Are you guys still are you having issues like seeing me and hearing me at the same time? Is everything good? It seems like TikTok's been doing this a little bit lately with lags and stuff. But we're good? I'm gonna assume we're good. Okay. "Why not? You're like my mother," he said. "You only want what's best for people." He opened the door to leave, and I was surprised that Octavia hadn't already come in and sent us to bed. Perhaps she was with her brother, or Vitruvius. When Marcellus left, Alexander looked sternly at me. "Don't think it. He's meant for Julia, Celine." "I'm not thinking anything." "Yes, you were, and you might as well stop it." He blew out the lamp and fell asleep, but I was still awake when a window slowly opened next door. There was a dull thud as something hit the ground outside. I raced to our balcony and threw back the curtains in time to see Marcellus disappearing into the darkness. What could he be thinking with so many of his uncle's guards outside? Perhaps they were in his pay. So far as I knew, word had never reached Octavian about our trip to the Temple of Isis, or what Marcellus had told the centurion. But I wondered where he could be going that was worth the risk. Hello, Julie from Kentucky. When I entered the library the next morning, Vitruvius studied me with an interested gaze. I hear you saved Caesar's life yesterday. Heat crept into my cheeks. It was Juba who saved him. But you sounded the alarm. You are very quick. And that's why someone as sharp as you will be able to understand this. He unfurled a long scroll and laid it on the table in front of me. Octavian's mausoleum, I said. Vitruvius nodded. Octavian had wanted something as impressive as my mother's tomb in Alexandria, with tall marble columns and a towering dome. But even though the sketch had a similar dome and the mausoleum was surrounded by a round columned portico, the building lacked the grandness of my mother's mausoleum. It was raised above the ground on a circular platform that would probably be made of limestone, with a flight of steps sweeping from the bottom to the top. The stairs were flanked by a pair of red granite obelisks, and although there was a simple elegance to it, no one would ever stop in amazement as people had done in Alexandria. I looked up from the sketch to Vitruvius and guessed, "You have made something simple that won't insult the plebes." Because right now he's afraid of assassination and of appearing too powerful, like Julius Caesar. Vitruvius smiled. Indeed, perhaps last night was the work of a lone man, or perhaps the assassin was really with this traitor, with this traitor the freedmen have taken to calling the Red Eagle. Either way, the people are angry. What will Caesar do? What can he do? Vitruvius rolled up the scroll. Enough attempts and the plebes will begin to believe that Caesar is a tyrant. He can build the grandest stadia and baths in Rome, but for himself it must be something simple. But will he like it? He appeared to like it very much when I showed it to him this morning. He was up. He is always up, pacing, writing, preparing speeches for the Senate. And will you show me how you executed this? There were measurements next to every wall down in the sketch, and near the stairs were equations I couldn't understand. I'm afraid I don't have time for a lesson today. When he saw my disappointment, he added, "But in a few days I shall. Until then, these are the chambers inside the mausoleum." He handed me a scroll on which he'd drawn empty rooms, labeling each one with its dimensions next to it. "Furnish them," he said simply. "Add mosaics, caryatids, and fountains. The plebes will only see the outside, so the furnishings can be as lavish as you want. And if I like what you've drawn, I may incorporate it in the final construction." I was shocked by the trust Vitruvius was placing in me. "Thank you," I said, and Vitruvius smiled. "These will be my best sketches," I promised him. I rolled the scroll carefully. As I was leaving, Vitruvius added, "Rome is proud of you. Caesar will not forget what you've done." I turned. "Do you think it means that Alexander and I will be sent back to Egypt?" Vitruvius hesitated. "Caesar has sent a prefect to rule Egypt in his place. But he could be recalled." "He could." His voice didn't offer much hope. "But before that would ever happen, Caesar will want to arrange your marriages. You must be very careful these next few years, Celine. You have seen Caesar at his most merciful," he said quietly. "But when they find this bowman, he will be crucified. And whoever helped him to get on that stage, even if it was Tarantilla herself, will die with him." I nodded. "I'll be careful," I promised. "And watchful." I began by being watchful in the ludus. When Magister Varius read passages from the Iliad, I noticed how he lingered on the passages that described Hector's wife and children, who were sold into slavery. He described Hector's fight as heroic, his death was valiant, and the sacking of his city was the greatest tragedy, since its inhabitants would lose, if not their lives, then their freedom. The longer he spoke about the bitterness of slavery, the more convinced I became that he could be the Red Eagle, and that Marcellus was helping him. Antonia had seen him with Gallia on the Palatine, and while it was possible that Gallia was writing the Acta alone, it seemed far more probable that someone with access to supplies of papyrus and ink was behind them, someone whose presence on the Palatine would never be questioned, who had a quick wit and a reason to be angry. And if Varius and Gallia were lovers, wouldn't that be the reason enough to rebel against slavery? Slaves were not allowed to marry unless freed, and on a magister's salary he could never afford a Gallic princess's freedom. That afternoon I studied Gallia as she mended a tunic on the portico at the Campus Martius. She didn't appear worried that someone might approach her with evidence of treachery, although when Marcellus announced that it was time for us to go to the Circus Maximus, and Juba suddenly appeared at her side, I could see she was surprised. "Are you coming with us?" she asked Juba. "Those are Caesar's orders." "But we already have guards," Julia complained. "Why do we need more?" "Perhaps you would rather stay at home?" Juba suggested. There's nowhere as safe as your own chamber." Julia narrowed her eyes, and as we made our way to the circus, she grumbled, "Now we can't do anything." "What do you mean?" "Juba is here. My father and he are like Romulus and Remus." "Didn't Romulus kill Remus?" Alexander asked warily. "You know what I mean," Julia said irritably. Behind us, Gallia and Juba were walking together, their heads bent in quiet conversation. "Everything we do will get back to him now. At least Gallia is a slave and knows enough to keep silent." I glanced behind me, hoping Gallia hadn't heard what she'd said. "And what about the guards who always follow us?" I asked. "Don't they report back to your father?" "Of course not," Marcellus answered. "We pay them." "You mean bribery?" my brother exclaimed. "Just a few denarii, and only when I've gambled too much or visited a place I shouldn't have." He winked at my brother, and I wondered if he could mean a lupanar. When we approached the circus, a large crowd was gathered around the entrance, and Juba said sternly, "What is this?" He pushed his way to the front, and the people fell away from him. "Another actum?" he shouted. "Who did this?" Suddenly, no one was interested anymore, and Juba grabbed the closest man by the arm. "When was this placed on the door?" The man shook his head. "I don't know," he trembled. "I saw it here this morning after we opened." "And no one took it down? Do you understand the penalty for supporting a rebel?" It isn't support," he stammered. "I certainly don't support it." "Then why is it up here?" "I don't know. I just place bets. I don't patrol the gates." Juba ripped down the scroll, and Marcellus stepped forward tentatively. "May I see it?" I thought that Juba would refuse, but he shoved the scroll at Marcellus, and we all gathered around. It was written in the same neat handwriting as the previous actum I'd seen, only this time the writer was denouncing the attempted assassination of Octavian, warning that bloodshed would only result in further bloodshed, and that rulers had as much right to a long life as slaves. He reminded his readers that Spartacus had failed, and that no rebellion could ever hope to achieve what votes of conscience by senators could. Then he went on to deride Octavian's punishments of the plebes, promising riots in the Suburra once the people began to starve. And there was more, something about helping slaves across the Mare Superum to their homelands, but Juba took back the scroll. "That's enough. You came here to watch the races, so let's watch them." He handed the crumpled actum to Gallia, who made it disappear into a beautifully embroidered bag at her side. I was always fascinated to see her clothing, including the embellished bags that no other slave ever carried. But Gallia was Octavia's favorite. We climbed to the seats reserved for Caesar's family, and when Juba had settled into conversation with Gallia, Marcellus whispered, "I wonder why this rebel is willing to criticize my uncle, but opposes assassination." "Probably because if your uncle died, it wouldn't be the patricians who'd suffer the most, but the plebes," I guessed. "The rich will always find something to eat. It's the slaves and freedmen who would starve." "Do you really think there would be riots?" Julia asked. "I should think so," Marcellus replied, keeping his eye on the bet-maker below us. When the man looked in our direction, Marcellus waved him over, taking out a purse full of denarii. But they won't be for long. Just as the freedmen are regretting their support of the Red Eagle and feeling hungry, the Ludi Romani will be here to distract them." "So you agree with their punishments?" I exclaimed. "Of course not. But that's what my uncle is thinking." Marcellus passed the bet-maker his purse and said shrewdly, "The Greens. I hear they have purchased new horses." "That's right, 20 new stallions, all from Arabia." Alexander smiled, and I knew at once that he'd been the one to procure this information. "The Greens," he said as well, and I gasped at the size of his purse. "I've been winning," he explained. "So what are the Ludi Romani?" "You haven't heard about the Ludi?" Julia cried. "They're only the biggest games on earth." "We had our own games," I said tersely. "Well, the Ludi Romani go on for 15 days. Chariot races, gladiatorial events, theatrical performances." She glanced uneasily at Juba. "Perhaps we won't be going to those." "And you think your father will want to celebrate after an attempt to assassinate him?" I asked. "Oh, it's not a celebration," Marcellus said. "It's a tradition. Canceling the Ludi would be like canceling—" He searched for the right word. "The month of June," Julia said helpfully. "Or deciding that there will be no more Saturnalia. Besides, it keeps the people happy. All work is stopped on those days, and everyone comes with food and circus padding." Alexander wrinkled his nose. "What is that?" Marcellus pointed to the bottom of the circus, where men were carrying thick mats made of rushes. "Their seats aren't covered like ours." Trumpets blared, and as the announcer signaled the start of the race, the gates were raised and chariots thundered onto the tracks. Julia and Alexander yelled themselves hoarse with Marcellus, and I took out my book, opening to the sketches Vitruvius had given me of Octavian's mausoleum. He wanted designs for inside the building, and, in all likelihood, nothing I produced would be used. But I was determined to surprise him. I would sketch such handsome designs that he would find them irresistible. Perhaps there were other architects he employed who were several decades older than I, but none of them had lived in Alexandria and seen what the Ptolemies had accomplished. None of them had studied in the museum or dedicated years to sketching the most beautiful marble caryatids and mosaics in the world. When I took out my ink and stylus, I noticed that Juba was watching me. "Sketching a new Rome?" he asked. "It's a commission." "Really? So you are being paid?" "No, I'm doing it to be helpful." Juba smiled. "Such a charitable nature, and not even 12. Soon you'll be passing out bread with Octavia." "I noticed you thanking her this morning," I retorted. "So you did appreciate the gift." He raised his brows. "Of course. It's the only portrait I have of my father." I clenched my jaw, determined not to be goaded by him any longer, and for the rest of the afternoon I made sure he couldn't see what I was drawing. "Good evening, Andrew." I think he meant to write Miss Nikki. Chapter 10. On the 7th day without the dole, there were riots in the Suburra. Although it came as no surprise to anyone but Octavia, the people began breaking into shops, stealing food from vendors in the streets, and setting fire to taverns that refused to defer charges. As we sat in the triclinium eating oysters and thrushes, listening to sweet tones played by a slave girl on the harp, the Suburra tore at itself like a rabid wolf. The hungry masses devoured anything that crossed their path, chickens, dogs, even cats. On the 8th night, when a soldier interrupted our meal to announce that a plebe had given up the bowman from the theater, I caught the triumphant look in Octavian's eyes. "Reinstate the dole tomorrow," he said. "Remind the people that I am paying for their grain with my own denarii, and tell them I have sold my statues to buy them food." The soldier smiled. "Certainly, Caesar." "And the criminal?" he asked, almost as though it were an afterthought. "One of your slaves. A kitchen boy, I believe." Octavian grew very still. "Kitchen boy or a man?" 16. "And are you sure that it's him?" "He escaped from the Palatine 3 weeks ago, and the plebes seem very certain. Even if it wasn't, he's still a runaway." Agrippa rose angrily. Well, is it him or isn't it? It is, the soldier said with more confidence. Octavian's decree that slaves could not purchase weapons hadn't mattered. There would always be dealers willing to sell anything for the right price. Whip him through the streets, Octavian said, and tomorrow crucify him next to the Forum. Octavia gasped, pressing her silk napkin delicately to her lips. Only this time she didn't protest. But how do they know the plebes aren't lying? Hoping he'll bring back the dole, I whispered. Marcellus's usually bright cheeks had grown pale. It's possible. And if they tortured him, Julia pointed out, he might confess to anything. Octavian didn't appear concerned. He reclined on his couch and continued making notes for his next speech in the Senate. But I couldn't stop thinking of the kitchen boy who'd been condemned to death, and the next day, after our time on the Campus Martius, I persuaded Juba to allow us to go to the Forum. To see a dead man? Julia complained as we made our way there. What's the purpose? I want to know if it's really him, I said. And if it isn't? She just wants to know, Marcellus said. I'd like to know as well. There will be no interfering with justice, Juba warned darkly. He was speaking to all of us, but he looked at me when he said it. We understand, Marcellus replied. We just want to go and see. Julia sighed heavily, and we walked the remaining distance to the Forum in silence, trailed by Juba and Gallia. When we arrived, there was no mistaking what was about to happen. Hundreds of Roman soldiers stood outside the Senate, shields at the ready and armed with swords. The red plumes of their helmets drooped in the sun, and I imagined how hot the men must be beneath their armor. But none of them moved. Only their eyes roamed the Forum, searching for possible rebels in the crowd. All of this for an execution? Alexander exclaimed. The rebel supporters might try to save him, Marcellus explained, or at least give him an easy death. Do you think that will happen? Julia asked eagerly, glancing around the Forum. I wouldn't bet on it, Juba said curtly. No one was allowed near the wooden cross, or the boy who would be bound to it. Juba led us to the steps of the Senate, where guards immediately cleared a space for distinguished witnesses. I felt a tightening in my stomach. Is it him? Alexander whispered at my side. The soldiers had whipped the kitchen boy through the streets, and his bare back was a bloodied mess. But even without shading my eyes from the sun, I could see that the slave had the same height and build as the masked bowman from the theater. I don't know. It might be. I looked at Julia, who had purchased an ofella, and was munching contentedly. How can you bear to watch this and eat? I demanded. It's just an execution. Most are done at the Esquiline Gate. This is the only one I've seen in the Forum. A rare treat, Juba remarked. I wonder why more aren't done near the Senate, she said. Possibly because the Forum is a place of business, not torture, he snapped. She popped a last piece of ofella into her mouth. You're probably right. She turned to me. My gods, just look at these people. All of this for a slave. It didn't occur to her that we were part of these people, watching as the accused assassin's wrists and ankles were bound to the cross with rope, and listening to his shrieks of pain as he was hoisted into the air. When I buried my face in Alexander's shoulder, Juba remarked, What's the matter? I thought you wanted to see this. I wanted to see if he was the bowman. And? I nodded, unable to speak. He wouldn't have heard me anyway. The boy's screams were too loud, and as the cross was raised, his body sank down in the sedile, a crude wooden seat that took the pressure from his wrists. Finally, even Julia had had enough. We should go, she said. I don't want to see this any more. Marcellus agreed. There was no sign of the Red Eagle, no indication that the kitchen boy's death would be swift. Imagine if he had tried to assassinate our father, Alexander reminded me quietly as we left. We would want him dead. But Octavian wasn't our father, and I couldn't stop wondering what might have happened if I had simply held my tongue. There was no more talk of the Red Eagle on the Palatine, but Octavian gave a special address to the Senate and requested a force of soldiers whose sole duty would be to protect him. The Senate agreed, assembling a professional body of men that Octavian called his Praetorian Guard. But after several weeks without any new acta posted in Rome, everyone began to wonder whether the Red Eagle might have gone into hiding. Why else would he be silent? Julia asked on the way to the Ludi Romani. The streets were swollen with people, carrying circus padding to the amphitheater for the start of the games, and our litter swayed dangerously as the bearers tried to avoid a collision. Perhaps he wants to distance himself from the kitchen boy, I suggested, holding on to the wooden sides. There was a sudden stop, and Julia jerked forward, steadying herself with her hand. "Be careful!" she screamed, tearing open the delicate curtains and swearing at the hapless bearers. When she'd twitched the curtains shut, she turned to me. "For 3 years now, the Red Eagle has appeared at the Ludi." I gasped. "In person?" "No. He goes by night and posts acta on the circus doors. Last year," she whispered, "he freed the gladiators who were going to fight in the arena." "So you think that there should be an end to slavery?" Julia looked at me with alarm. "Of course not. But imagine a man daring enough to free gladiators from their cells." She sighed. "Spartacus was courageous, but the Red Eagle," she whispered eagerly, "could be anyone. He might not even be a slave." I recalled Gallia's meeting with Magister Varius. Since then, I'd tried several times to speak with her about the Red Eagle, and every time she'd dismissed me with a wave. It would be dangerous to fall in love with a rebel, I warned. Julia laughed. "Plenty of women fall in love with gladiators, and most of the gladiators are criminals." She opened the curtain and pointed to the merchants on the side of the road. "You see what they're selling?" "Ophele?" "No." She made a face. "Look closer." "Are those—" I clapped my hand over my mouth. Julia giggled. The shopkeepers were selling statuettes of gladiators with erect penises. "Everyone knows that women lust after them." She let the curtain fall back into place. "Even Horatia has had one," she confessed. I leaned forward. "Without her husband knowing?" "Pollio has taken 6 of her slave girls. She deserves some happiness." "But what if he catches her?" "It was only once, and he'll never divorce her." "How do you know?" "Because he told my father that he never wants anything but 14-year-old girls." "And what does he think? She won't ever grow old?" "Sure. But she will always be small, like you." I shuddered at the thought of a man like Pollio taking me to his couch and pressing his naked stomach against mine, just like the man on the Palatine. "I will never let that happen to me again. I will follow my mother to the grave before I'm subjected to that." I suspected that Julia could read the disgust on my face because she added, "Horatia swore that she'd open her wrists before she wed Pollio." There was a shrill scream on the other side of the curtain, and Julia rushed to open it again. On the steps of a temple, an old man was thrashing 2 boys with a whip. They knelt on the steps of the temple and cowered, covering their heads with their arms. "Why don't they run?" I cried. "They're slaves." Julia leaned forward to get a better view. "In fact, they're Fabius's slaves." "You recognize him?" She threw a look over her shoulder. "He's one of the richest men in Rome." The cries of the 2 boys were terrible to hear. I covered my ears with my hands. But what could they have done? "To Fabius? I've heard it doesn't take much more than rebuffing his advances." "To boys?" "And girls, and widows, and matrons." "Disgusting," she said, and let the curtain fall into place. When we arrived, Agrippa made certain that Caesar's box was ready, then returned to help us from our litters. "This is the new amphitheater," Julia said eagerly. "I wonder what our seats will be like." Members of Octavian's Praetorian Guard escorted us through the crowd. Armed soldiers cleared away the plebes, but I noticed that Octavian still walked between Juba and Agrippa. "So what do you think?" a familiar voice asked, and when I turned, Vitruvius was standing with Octavia. He smiled. "Brand new, built by Consul Titus Statilius Taurus." "It's very handsome," I said cautiously. The amphitheater towered above the Campus Martius, and even though it was swarming with people, its elegance was undisturbed. The ground floor was occupied by shops, tucked neatly between the painted arches, and arch columns had been carved like friezes into the sides. But, Vitruvius asked, but I would have chosen red granite instead of limestone. The limestone will look dirty in a few years' time. Vitruvius smiled. I would have to agree with you. Vitruvius tells me you have a strong understanding of geometry, Octavia said, taking his arm, and that he is exceptionally impressed by your designs for my brother's mausoleum. When I looked to Vitruvius in surprise, Octavia laughed. Oh, he is sparing with his praise, but he's shown me your work. I'd like to see it, Marcellus said. Her sketches aren't in the library, Vitruvius replied. Julia was silent. When we reached Caesar's box with its wine-colored awnings and wide silk couches, she purposefully sat between me and Marcellus, turning her back to me to ask him, So who will you bet on? We can place bets on the gladiators, Alexander asked. Sure, Marcellus said. Then he amended, Of course, there's no method to it, not like what you've shown me with the horses. You simply pick a number, 50, 33, and if that gladiator survives, you win. Are there odds? Alexander, I said sharply, you can't bet on men's lives. I bet on them in the circus. Those are just chariots. Alexander looked abashed. Come on, Celine. If I win, I'll give you the winnings for your home. What home? Julia asked. Her foundling home, Marcellus replied, but not so loudly that Octavian, on the couch next to us, could hear. Julia stared at me. I didn't know about this. It's nothing, I said quickly. Marcellus knows about it. Because he saw the sketch. It's just a place I imagined. For foundlings, Marcellus explained. She's interested in charity like my mother. How nice, Julia said, but her tone implied otherwise. It probably won't come to anything, I said. Julia folded her arms across her chest. Why not? Because who would build a home for foundlings? And why would anyone listen to me? I might, she said pointedly, and most likely for Marcellus's benefit. If I were Caesar's wife. I was silent. You have a very kind heart, Celine. I wish I were so good. But I could see that she didn't. She was content to eat ofele during the executions and step over wailing infants so long as Marcellus didn't think she was callous. And although Marcellus would never criticize her, she couldn't bear it when he praised me. So are you betting? She asked. I shook my head. If Alexander wishes to bet on death, then he can. Really? My brother leaned back on the couch so he could see around Marcellus and Julia. You won't be upset? I refused to answer him. Oh, they're going to die anyway, Julia said. And betting on it won't make a difference, Alexander pointed out. The bet maker appeared, and from her couch in front of us, Livia said gleefully, 20 denarii on the first gladiator. To live or die, Domina? Die, she said, and next to her, Octavian passed the man a heavy purse. And for you, Domina? Octavia considered. The first 5 gladiators. Living or dead? Living, she said pointedly, and her brother smiled. When the bet maker came to Alexander, I turned my face away. It's not nice, is it? Antonia asked. She shared a couch with her sister and Vipsania. On the other side of them, Tiberius and his younger brother Drusus were rolling dice. I try not to watch whenever the men die. Are they all condemned criminals? No. Some are slaves who were purchased for fighting. Aren't there gladiatorial events in Egypt? No, we don't kill men for sport. Oh, there's women too, she said sadly. And animals. Here? Sure. Look. The trumpets sounded, and as the gates of the arena were pulled up, a group of sword-carrying men entered from beneath the amphitheater. They wore strange sandals laced up to the knee, and short tunics, and I realized with a start that some were mere boys. Who are they? Telegenii, Antonia said. The consul who built this amphitheater found them south of Carthage and brought them here to fight. There was a loud gasp from the crowd in the arena as 7 leopards were set loose. They're not going to kill the cats, I exclaimed. Certainly, or they'll be killed themselves. I sat forward. Is this what you bet on? I shouted at Alexander. No, no one said there would be leopards. What's the matter? Marcellus asked. Those animals, Alexander pointed wildly, are sacred in Egypt. We don't kill them for meat, and certainly not for entertainment. Oh, this is just the opening act, Julia said. There's only 7. Then the real fights will begin. Alexander glanced at me, and I could see the fear in his eyes. If our mother had been alive, she would have never forgiven us for watching this. Do you think they've brought this to Egypt? I asked coldly in Parthian. Yes, he said quietly, and when we return, we'll forbid it. The announcer narrated the fight, and whenever the crowds cheered, I closed my eyes and imagined that I was back in Alexandria, where the museum towered over the gleaming city, and philosophers went to the theater for entertainment. It's not that bad, Julia said critically. You can open your eyes. They're nearly all dead. The leopards or the telegenii? The leopards. Only 2 telegenii have been killed. I opened my eyes, but I refused to watch. Instead, I turned and looked at Gallia, who was sitting behind us among the men of the Praetorian Guard. When she caught my gaze, she beckoned to me with her hand. I left my position on the couch next to Julia, and Gallia made space for me on hers. Not enjoying the games? No, I admitted. Oh, but you haven't seen the best part, she said dryly. When the gladiators are done being savaged, 2 men will come out and get them. One will be dressed as Hermes, the other as Charon, the messenger god and the ferryman of the dead. What do? They collect the bodies. But first Hermes prods the gladiator with a hot iron, and if he moves, Charon takes a mallet and crushes his skull. I covered my mouth with my hand. So even if he could survive, he's killed? Yes. The trumpets blared for a second time, and Hermes made his appearance with Charon, just as she said. They have all placed bets on this, even Octavia, and Julia is enjoying it. Gallia nodded. I know, but perhaps you judge Domina Julia too harshly. I glanced up in surprise. I don't pass any judgment on Julia at all. Gallia smiled as if she didn't believe me. She has not had it easy. She's the daughter of Caesar. And what of her mother? I didn't know what to say. Do you see the woman up there? Gallia indicated a fine-featured matron several rows above us, where the women of Rome were forced to sit apart from the men. The woman possessed a fascinating beauty, and she was watching Julia with attention that never wavered. That is Scribonia, Domina Julia's mother. When Scribonia caught us staring at her, she smiled sadly. I turned to Gallia. She's beautiful. Why did Caesar divorce her? She was not obedient. Now she is only allowed to see her daughter from the upper seats of these games. Julia can't visit her? Once a year, during Saturnalia, she may bring her mother a gift. I gasped at the cruelty. It was no wonder Julia had been so interested in my mother. And now all she had was Livia. Bitter, selfish, jealous Livia. Do you think she ever visits Scribonia secretly? I asked. Gallia gave a little smile. The men of the Praetorian Guard around us were cheering, ignoring us completely. Of course, she whispered, but how can secret visits be enough for a mother or a daughter? I looked around the amphitheater. This place is filled with secrets, more than you know. I hesitated. Are there secrets about my father in here? She gave me a long, searching look before answering, yes. Where? She indicated a woman seated below Scribonia. Her eyes were painted with heavy shadow, and her long hair was dressed with small gems and pearls. Only actresses and lupe wore so much paint in Rome. Gallia said, Domina Cytheris. Does she work in the theater? Not anymore, but when she did, she was your father's mistress. She studied my face to see my reaction, but I wasn't surprised. And who is she mistress to now? I asked. The pearls in her hair and expensive jewels at her throat had not come free, and Charmian used to say that women who couldn't keep their legs closed couldn't keep their purses shut either. Dominus Gallus, the prefect that Caesar had sent to govern Egypt. I gave a small gasp, and Gallia placed her hand on mine. I know it is not easy. So why isn't she there with him? I asked bitterly. She has told him she prefers to entertain in Rome. I thought of the irony that my father's former lupa, an actress who had performed nude on the stage, now had the choice of living in Egypt's palace. My mother had been forced to take her own life, and now a woman like Cytheris could sleep in her bed and paint her eyes with her coal. But Cytheris had turned down the opportunity. Hadn't she seen paintings of Alexandria? Didn't she want to know what it would feel like to lie in the palace and listen to the waves crash against the rocks while the gulls called to one another on the shore? I touched the pearl diadem in my hair, and Gallia said tenderly, "This is why I do not like to tell you these things." "It doesn't bother me," I lied. "What else?" I ignored the sound of metal on metal and the wild cheering of the crowd. "Is there anyone else here my father would have known?" Gallia indicated a young man seated below us, whose light hair and broad shoulders seemed strangely familiar. "That is your brother, Dominus Jullus, by your father's third wife. And he looks just like Antyllus." Jullus and Antyllus had been brothers, but only Antyllus had made the terrible decision to follow my father to Alexandria. I watched as Jullus tilted his head back with laughter and the golden hair tumbled over his ears, just like Antyllus and Ptolemy. I felt an instant connection to him that I had never felt toward Antonia or her sister. Perhaps it was because I had never had sisters, only brothers. "I wish I could meet him." "Not possible," Gallia warned sternly. "You do not want Caesar to think the Antonii are rising again. Better to watch him from afar. Like Scribonia watches Julia?" Gallia nodded sadly. "Yes." There was a great roar of disapproval from below, and then suddenly everyone was standing. "What's happening?" I cried. A praetorian turned to me. "One of the gladiators has been wounded." "Many have been wounded," Gallia remarked. "But this man is a favorite. He has survived combat for 3 days, and now Charon is coming with his mallet." "They will kill a favorite even if he might live?" "He's been wounded, princess. His eyes are closed. It doesn't matter to Charon if a physician might save him." Although the amphitheater seats rose in tiers, I couldn't see anything above the heads of the people in front of me. I was too small, and there were too many of them standing on their seats. Perhaps it was better. I could hear the crowd's sharp intake of breath as the mallet shattered the gladiator's skull, and Antonia's shriek pierced the sudden silence that had descended over the amphitheater. Octavia rushed to calm her, but she wouldn't be calmed. Her shrieking continued until Marcellus placed his hand over her mouth. "Be quiet!" Octavian rose. "I am done for the day." "I'm sorry," Octavia said. "She's afraid." Oop, missed the spot. "She should be," he said angrily. "There will be no more of Hermes and Charon. Agrippa, you will inform them." "Then how will the battles end?" Marcellus asked. "When one gladiator is too tired or too injured to fight." Octavian turned to Antonia and held up her chin, wiping the tears from her eyes. "No more death," he promised. Though when the bet-maker returned with various winnings, I noticed that Octavian didn't refuse to accept his. Inside Octavia's villa, Alexander handed his heavy purse to me. "For your foundlings," he said quietly. I placed the purse inside the metal chest Octavia had recently given to us, and Alexander locked the chest with the key he wore next to his bulla. Marcellus and Julia stood at the door, waiting for us to join them. "Come," Marcellus urged. "We can watch the races from my uncle's platform." "But won't he be angry?" Alexander asked. "He said he was done for the day." "He was only upset that he will have to pay the Lannistae 300 denarii, Julia said wryly. "What is a Lanista?" Alexander asked. "You know," Marcellus prompted, "one of the men who own the gladiators. When a gladiator dies, the sponsor of the event has to pay the Lannistum for his loss. The Ludi Romani are always sponsored by Caesar, and popular gladiators are worth more." So that means my father will have to pay 300 denarii just for one man. By banishing Hermes and Charon, he won't have to pay the Lannistae anything." Julia smiled. "You didn't think he did it for poor little Antonia, did you?" The ludi went on for 14 more days, and by September 19th no one wanted to return to Magister Varius and our studies. Marcellus pleaded with Octavia to let us have one more day, but her answer was firm. "Your uncle's dies natalis is in 6 days, and there will be 2 days off for celebration. I believe that is enough." Octavia walked us onto the portico, where Juba and Gallia were already waiting. "Do you celebrate birthdays in Egypt?" she asked. "No," Alexander replied, "but our father sometimes brought us presents." Octavia pressed her lips together, perhaps thinking of the gifts her daughters had never received, because their father was with us in Alexandria. "They were always small presents," I added swiftly, "of little importance." "At least he remembered," Octavia said quietly. I scowled at Alexander, who understood what he had done. "He never spent much time with us anyway," he said, "even if it was our dies natalis." Octavia smiled, but it was bitter. I could feel her watching us as we disappeared down the Palatine. When we reached the Forum, Magister Varius greeted us at the door of the ludus. "Enjoy yourselves," Juba said merrily, and I imagine that Magister Varius understood what we were feeling, since the next few days were full of games. There was a contest to see who could memorize the longest passage of Euripides, and a game testing our knowledge of the Muses, both of which I won. But Tiberius had memorized the longest passages of both Aeneas and Terence, Romans whose works I couldn't be bothered with. By the end of September our games were over, and Magister Varius was determined to introduce us to rhetoric, the art of public speaking. Marcellus sighed audibly, and Julia sank lower in her seat. "Today, I would like you to spend time outside the Senate, listening to the lawyers debate." When Julia groaned, Magister Varius ignored her. "You will follow a trial until its end, and you may not choose a trial that ends today." "What a waste of time," Julia said angrily as we walked toward the Campus Martius. Juba and Gallia remained several paces behind. She turned around and glared at them. "Do you think they might lie for us and pretend that we've gone?" "What?" Marcellus asked, "and we'd make up a trial?" "Well, when are we supposed to watch one?" she demanded. "We're going to have to forget the circus," he said, "at least for a week." He didn't say how long the trial had to be. "We can choose one that ends tomorrow." Marcellus gave Julia a long look. And be told to do it all over again? Julia turned to me. "I don't know how you stand it, working with Vitruvius from the break of dawn and studying Magister Varius's works all day." "She likes it," Tiberius responded on my behalf. "Some people actually enjoy learning." "But why? All Vitruvius teaches you is measurements." "Measurements to construct a building," I replied. "He took me to the Temple of Apollo yesterday. It's almost finished." "Really?" Marcellus took a shortcut across the Campus Martius. "What's inside?" "A library with gold and ivory paneling, and a statue of the god sculpted by Scopas." "Did Juba find it?" Marcellus asked. I shrugged. "That's what Vitruvius says." In the distance, I could see Livia and Octavia on the shaded portico of the stables, both weaving on their wooden looms and sitting as far apart as decorum would allow. When we reached the portico, Octavia stood. "Juba," she smiled. "Gallia, thank you both for bringing them safely. Are all of my children behaving themselves?" "Aside from the complaining," Juba said, "yes." "You would complain too if you had to go to school while everyone else was on vacation," Marcellus grumbled. "Ah, the terrible price of being heir," Juba said. "He's not heir yet," Livia snapped. "Forgive me, possible heir." "We all know Octavian wants Marcellus," Tiberius retorted, "so why keep pretending?" Livia looked at her husband, who was swimming with Agrippa while guards kept watch on the bank. "Octavian has told me he has not decided. There's no reason not to make you heir." "No reason in the world," Marcellus returned sarcastically. "Come on, Alexander, I want to go swim." Marcellus and Alexander entered the stables, and Tiberius glowered at his mother. "Why can't you just leave it alone?" he shouted. Livia stood swiftly and delivered a slap to his face. Tiberius turned red, and when he had disappeared into the stables, Octavia warned, "He will come to resent you." "How do you know what he will come to do? Are you an augur?" Julia kept her eyes on the wooden loom in front of her, and I didn't look up from my sketches, in case Livia turned her wrath on me. "Get me more loom weights," Livia shouted at Gallia. "Don't move," Octavia said. "If she wants more weights, she can get them herself. They're inside." Gallia hesitated, caught between obeying Octavia and angering Livia further. She met Livia's fearsome gaze without blinking, and when it became clear that she wasn't going to move, Livia stormed from her chair. Later, when the men returned from their swim, Julia whispered the story to Alexander and Marcellus. We were making our way back to the forum to observe a trial when she said eagerly, "And then Gallia simply refused to move." Behind us, Gallia walked between Tiberius and Juba, the incident on the portico forgotten. But Marcellus shook his head. "My mother is creating trouble for Gallia. She shouldn't have done that." "Gallia isn't Livia's slave," I said heatedly. "She shouldn't be anyone's slave." "Well, she belongs to my mother," Marcellus replied, "and my mother is putting her in danger. No one can afford to make an enemy of Livia." "I understand why Octavia did it," Julia said. "She's tired of Livia thinking she owns all of Rome." "She does," Marcellus pointed out. "No, my father does. Livia's just a whore with a good marriage." Alexander snickered, and I covered my mouth to keep from laughing. Julia smiled naughtily at me. "Now let's find the shortest trial and let's get this over with." But there was only one trial happening in the forum. A crowd was growing around the podium where a lawyer was addressing the seated Judases, who would eventually return a verdict of guilt or innocence. "I can't see," Julia complained. "What's going on?" 200 slaves are on trial for the murder of their master, Gaius Fabius," Juba said. Julia gasped. "Fabius?" She turned to me. "Don't you remember him, Celine? He was the man you saw beating those boys at the temple." "And all 200 slaves helped murder him?" I exclaimed. "When one slave murders his master, all must be punished," Juba said levelly. Suddenly, Julia was interested. "Do you think we can get a better view?" Juba raised his brows. "Certainly." He took us behind the podium, where rows of slaves were chained together by the neck, and we could watch the backs of the lawyers as they addressed both the Judases and the crowds. "Look how young they are," I whispered to Alexander. "Some of the slaves were no more than 5 or 6, and could have never taken part in any killing." I turned to Juba. "Will they really be put to death?" "Of course, if they are found guilty." "How can you be so callous?" I demanded. "Because it's not his problem," Tiberius said. "What is he supposed to do about it?" The public lawyer for the slaves stopped talking, and was replaced at the podium by the lawyer for the dead Gaius Fabius. "You have heard," he began in a thundering voice, "pitiful stories of slaves who could not have taken part in the killing. Women, children, old men who are nearly crippled and blind. But what did they see? What did they witness and keep silent about? Make no mistake," the lawyer said angrily, "watching and participating are no different. We cannot know which among these dregs stood by while Gaius Fabius was strangled in his chamber, then knifed more than a dozen times." There was a groan from the crowd, and at the front, seated on wooden benches, the Judases shook their heads. "We must set an example," he said at once. "Nearly 35 years ago, a similar trial ended in the death of 400 slaves. That jury understood that a message must be sent, one that discourages any slave from killing his master for fear that everyone will be punished. We must stop this now," he shouted, "or who will be next? You?" He pointed at an old man on the bench, whose neck was weighted down by heavy cold chains. "You?" he demanded, looking at a second young man in the toga of a judex. "Forget what you heard before this. Certainly, a few slave children will die. But are their lives more important than yours? More important than those of your wives and children?" He stepped down from the podium, and Julia watched with wide-eyed fascination. "What happens now?" she whispered. "That's it," Tiberius said. "What? No more arguing?" Marcellus asked. The crowd began to disperse, and Juba started walking. "No more until tomorrow." "But how many days will it go on?" Julia asked. "As many as it takes." She regarded Juba crossly. "But that could be a month, even 2 months." "It can't be 2 months," Tiberius retorted. "Courts shut down in November and December." "So who decides when it's over?" I asked. "The Judases," Gallia replied. Until then she had been silent. Now she added quietly, "Those poor little children." The next day no one complained about going to the forum. Even my brother and Julia were more interested in the fate of the 200 slaves than in the races at the Circus Maximus. I could hear the people on the streets talking about Gaius Fabius's slaves, and there seemed to be outrage, not at his murder, but at the trial. 53 children, a woman said in the crowd. "It isn't right." Though we had arrived at the same time we had before, word had spread throughout Rome, and more than 1,000 people swelled around the podium and the Judases' seats. "Look at how angry the people are. The Judases have to set them free," I exclaimed. "They don't have to do anything," Juba replied, leading us to the space behind the podium reserved for honored guests. This time, several senators were already there, watching the lawyers arguing. The Judases will make their decisions based on the principles of justice as they see them, not on the wishes of an angry mob. "Then you agree with this?" I exclaimed. Juba looked at the miserable chain of slaves fettered by heavy iron shackles. Among them was a little brown-haired girl who smiled when Juba met her gaze. "I agree with justice." The lawyer for Gaius Fabius was at the podium, banging his fist against the wood. "Would you like to see the murderer?" he demanded, and the crowds cheered. "Bring him forth!" The guards stepped forward with a slave who was being held separately, and I whispered to Julia, "Is that one of the boys Fabius was beating at the temple?" "Who knows? All Gauls look the same." I noticed Gallia shaking her head. Fabius's lawyer pumped his fist in the air. "This is the slave responsible for the murder, and he doesn't even deny it," he cried. "Which of you thinks that a boy of 14 could have done it on his own? Strangled his master, stabbed his master, then dumped his master's body into the atrium pool?" There was a general shaking of heads, and the slave looked down at his feet. Like the kitchen boy, he knew he was lost. Then the lawyer inhaled dramatically. "Who here believes that slaves are blind?" A few members of the crowd laughed, and I felt a familiar twisting in my stomach. "Then no one here believes that a murder could take place without anyone hearing, without anyone suspecting, without anyone ever seeing this Filius Nullius drag his master's body away from his chamber. There are accomplices," he promised, "and we must teach them Roman justice." He strode away from the podium with the air of a man who knows he has won. The lawyer for Fabius's slaves looked beaten before he even opened his mouth. His thin shoulders were hunched in his heavy toga, and he looked as if the heat of the day was draining him of color. "There is no knowing," he began, "who saw or heard Gaius Fabius die. There is no one in this crowd who can tell me which of these slaves is an accomplice. Perhaps it was early morning, and while the elder slaves worked, it was the children who witnessed this terrible crime. I do not deny that this slave is responsible." He flicked his wrist, and the guards took the boy away, holding him near the other slaves. I saw the boy look at an older woman and felt certain from her tears that this was his mother. "But who here wishes to punish the innocent?" the lawyer went on. "The children who have never learned right from wrong." There was an uneasy shuffling in the crowd, and the men who had laughed wore serious faces now. "It's true that if you allow these slaves to be put to death, you are sending a message across Rome. But the message is that we are no different from barbarians." I could see that he had been arguing all afternoon, and the strain was beginning to show. "Look at these faces," he implored. "This one." He stepped back and held up the chin of the beautiful girl who had smiled at Juba. She can't be more than 6 years old. What has she done to deserve death? She hasn't even lived life." I saw Gallia blinking back tears. "And this child," the lawyer said. He touched the shoulder of a boy who was not more than 10. What might he become if we let him live? He might serve another master well. He might buy his freedom. He might become as wealthy and powerful and useful as Caesar's consul Agrippa." There was an eager murmur in the crowd, and the lawyer fixed his gaze on the 7 rows of Judases. "Have pity," he demanded. "Place blame on the shoulders it should rest on, not upon the innocent." He left the podium, and for several moments no one said anything. "Do you think a decision will be made tomorrow?" Marcellus asked. "It appears that way," Juba said quietly, and I wondered whether he had been moved by the public speaker's plea. As we walked through the forum, Julia said brightly, "Who would have thought a trial could be so interesting? Perhaps we should place bets." For the first time I saw Marcellus recoil in disgust. "What?" she said. "It's no different from the arena." "Perhaps I should not have bet there either," he said shortly, and Julia gave me a puzzled look. Oof. Let's see here. One more chapter. We got time. All right. Oh, Miss Deborah, there you are. Oh, I'm sorry, honey, you're not feeling good. I hope you feel better soon. Chapter 11. The crowd that came to witness the fate of Gaius Fabius's 200 slaves filled the forum all the way from the courtyard to the carcer courtyard of the carcer to the steps of the temple of Castor and Pollux. We had been allowed to skip our time on the Campus Martius to hear the Judases pronounce their verdict, and even Octavian came with Livia and Agrippa. "Where are your sisters?" I asked Marcellus, "and why isn't your mother here?" He stepped forward to get a better view. Although we were standing behind the raised wooden platform, hundreds of senators jostled around us. "Trials of this sort upset her," he said, "and she'd never allow my sisters to come. They saw a man sentenced to death once and have never stopped talking about it." "So you think they'll be found guilty?" I worried. "Certainly the slave who killed Fabius. The others—" He hesitated. I don't know. It would be unfair to send them to their deaths." "And what could the children possibly have done?" my brother added. "If the Red Eagle were here," Marcellus whispered, "there would be an acta on every temple door decrying this." "Perhaps he's waiting," I suggested, "to see what the Judases do." Although Octavia had chosen not to come, the rest of Rome appeared to be in attendance. And because Octavian was with us, the lawyers spoke swiftly. Their last arguments were the most moving. Gaius Fabius's lawyer pled for justice, pointing to Fabius's wife in the crowd, who dabbed at her eyes. But the lawyer for the slaves begged for reason, reminding the Judases of the children and old women who could not have taken part in a murder. I watched Octavian's face as each Judex stood to announce his verdict, and when all of them pronounced the slave boy guilty, he nodded as if in agreement. There was a deafening cheer from the crowd, and the boy cast a fearful glance at his mother, who buried her face in her chained hands. "This is it," Julia said. "I wonder what they'll do." She brushed a stray black curl from her forehead and stood on tiptoe to see the faces of the Judases. The first Judex stood and announced his verdict to the 200 slaves. "Guilty," he said, and I looked to Octavian, whose face was an expressionless mask. The second Judex rose, and when he, too, pronounced a verdict of guilty, the people began to grow restless. "Perhaps we should leave," Juba suggested as the third and fourth Judex announced their verdicts of guilty. "Marcellus," Octavian called sharply, "Tiberius, we're leaving." "But we haven't even heard the verdict," Julia complained. "Perhaps you would rather stay here and be killed?" Livia demanded. The crowd was growing increasingly discontent, and as more Judases pronounced their verdict of guilty, some of the freedmen began the chant of Red Eagle. "Go!" Octavian shouted to us. "Go!" The praetorian cleared a path through the forum. But as the last Judex announced his verdict, the freedmen and slaves became uncontrollable. I could hear the sounds of rioting behind us, statues being shattered, and soldiers clashing with the people. A wave of angry men rushed toward us, and Livia cried shrilly, "It's Spartacus all over again!" Octavian took her arm, then the guards surrounded us and began to run. The angry slaves didn't need weapons. All they needed was fire and stones. When we reached the Palatine, Octavia rushed from her portico. "What happened?" she cried. "Guilty," Gallia replied, and Octavia went pale. "All 200 will be put to death?" She looked at her brother. That was their verdict. "But don't you think—" His look silenced her. We followed him to the platform he had built to watch the races, and saw a column of smoke rising from the forum. "So the plebes are rioting again," Tiberius remarked. Octavian clenched his jaw. "This will not be tolerated." "It's these slaves that are the problem," Livia exclaimed. "They have to be controlled. Why not have them all wear one color, or brand them?" "A third of Rome's population is in servitude," Juba reminded her. "Do you really want 300,000 slaves able to identify one another in the streets?" Octavian pursed his lips. "That's right. They cannot be branded." I stole a glance at Gallia, but her face was impossible to read. "What about a leniency in the laws?" Octavia asked. "And that would make these slaves less violent?" her brother shouted. Octavia stepped back. "Yes!" I could see that she was holding back tears. "If they feel that they have a place in court to challenge abusive masters, then perhaps it will." Octavian looked to Marcellus. "And what would you do?" he asked suddenly. It was a test, and Marcellus glanced uneasily at his mother. "I would bring fewer slaves to Rome," he said. Tiberius snorted. "And who would till the fields? Romans aren't having children. The men don't want to spend the denarii, and the women don't want stretch marks." Marcellus laughed. "And how would you know that?" Tiberius flushed. I listen." "It's true," Octavia said quietly. Behind her, the thick column of smoke was widening. "Women don't want the risk or the disfigurement." Octavian clenched his jaw. "Then perhaps they need incentives." "Such as what?" Tiberius asked under his breath. "A festival of fornication?" At Octavian's look, he immediately fell silent. "Monetary incentives," Agrippa said. "For having children?" Marcellus exclaimed. "There will be dangerous times," Octavian warned darkly, "when there are more slaves than Romans." "Then we should banish the columna lactaria," Tiberius suggested. "Those children all become slaves. Imagine them all rising up." "And tomorrow will be the real test," Agrippa warned. He didn't explain further, but when Gallia and Juba escorted us to the ludus the next morning, I realized what he meant. Julia covered her mouth with her hand, and Gallia made a poor attempt at suppressing a smile. "I don't believe it," Tiberius said. At every temple door, at every crossroads, crowds gathered to read the latest actum. Even on the doors of the temple of Venus Genitrix, the Red Eagle and his men had nailed their pieces of papyrus. Juba clenched his jaw, and as soon as the plebes saw him approach, one of the octa was immediately torn down. The other one he ripped away himself. "I don't understand," my brother said. "Why aren't the priests taking them down?" "They're afraid to anger the plebes," Julia whispered. "And even if the octa are taken down, people are probably copying them as we speak." When Juba returned with the crumpled actum, Marcellus asked eagerly, "What does it say?" "Nothing you need to know about." "But we're going to read it anyway," Tiberius argued as we crossed the forum. "If not now, then at some other point." "We just want to be aware of what's happening in Rome," Julia pleaded. "Magister Varius is always telling us to pay attention." Juba smiled. "I doubt that reading treachery was what he meant." "But these are all over," Marcellus argued. "There's dozens of them. Do you want us to be the only people in Rome who don't know what the Red Eagle is saying?" "My father wouldn't care," Julia promised as we reached the ludus. "He never keeps these things from us." It was true. In the triclinium there was nothing Octavian wouldn't discuss, from banishing Lupanaria from Rome to prosecuting adulteresses. This is how we learn. Juba handed the scroll to her. I'll be interested in hearing what this teaches you. Everyone gathered around Julia. There was no harm in reading, only in speaking, and the 5 of us read in low voices. It began with a stern warning against murder. There are thousands of other ways to get revenge. While I cannot advocate stealing from your masters, thievery comes in many different forms. Your lives have been stolen from you. Why then should you break your backs attempting to meet the demands of your masters? If it's a farm you work on, be slow with the wheat. If it's a lender you work for, make your records faulty. You cannot be punished for stealing time, or for simple accidents with the reed pen. And if you fear death at the hands of your enslavers, remember, death can come even when you are innocent. Do not forget the 200 slaves who will die tomorrow with no blood on their hands. Women, children, infants still too young to walk. The actum went on to list the name of every slave who would be executed at dawn. This is terrible, I whispered. How did he find out the name of every slave? Alexander wondered. Are we finished? Juba demanded, or would we like to go on discussing this in the open forum? Inside the ludus, Magister Varius was waiting at his desk. He didn't stand to greet us, and he looked as though he'd had very little sleep. Did you hear about the Red Eagle? Julia asked eagerly. Yes, Magister Varius said curtly, and I presume he is the reason we're all late this morning. But we had to read it, Marcellus protested. Magister Varius held up his hand. I don't want to know. Just take your seats and begin your work. Tiberius hesitated in front of his desk. There's not going to be a contest today? Magister Varius shook his head firmly. No. That evening, Octavian's mood was sour as well. What's the matter with everyone? Julia asked. Although a harpist's music filled the triclinium, Marcellus lowered his voice. What do you think? Tomorrow 200 innocent slaves are to be executed. She broke open an oyster and dipped it in garum sauce. So how does that affect my father? Octavian had invited his favorite poets to entertain him. Livy and Maecenas dined next to Horace and Virgil, but even their humor couldn't make him laugh. I saw Tarantilla reach for a glass bowl, and when her hand brushed Octavian's, he still didn't smile. He thought he had crucified the Red Eagle, Marcellus guessed, and now that the rebel has returned, he's nervous about what might happen tomorrow. I don't see how he can free them, my brother said practically. They're chained inside the carcer. And they'll be taken by more than 100 soldiers to the Esquiline Gate for crucifixion, Julia added. There isn't any hope. But Marcellus wasn't sure. He managed it before. Without his own soldiers, he'll never manage this, my brother said. At the table next to us, Livia rose and addressed the diners. Shall we hear the first poem of the night? Horace, give us something triumphant. A balding man stood up from his couch and took his place in the center of the chamber. Triumphant, he said musingly, but which one of Caesar's many triumphs? The Battle of Actium, Livia said, or Cleopatra's death. Horace smiled. An ode, then, to Queen Cleopatra. Marcellus looked from me to Alexander. We should leave, I said immediately, but Julia put her hand on my arm. Livia wants my father to be upset with you. Don't risk it, she whispered. His mood is already dark, Marcellus warned quietly. Just stay and try not to listen. But it was impossible to ignore the lies that Horace twisted into a poem. When Horace was finished, my brother looked at me. Although the poem had begun by portraying our mother as a drugged queen, the last 3 stanzas praised her as a warrior who accepted her death unflinchingly. Horace bowed his head respectfully in our direction, and Octavian stood up from his couch to applaud. Magnificent, he looked at his wife. What did you think? Livia smiled weakly. Hi, Luca. Hi, Luca. Livia smiled weakly. The beginning had a great deal of promise. Unfortunately, I found the end dispensable. Octavian looked down at Tarantilla. Inspired, she told him. I turned to my brother. I'm leaving, I whispered. You can't go by yourself. If you don't want to come, Gallia's in the atrium. She'll take me back. Alexander hesitated. I won't hear another poem about Egypt, I told him. But Octavian will think it's a slight. Then you stay. I stood without finishing my meal, and when I reached the atrium, I searched among the seats for Gallia. A boy rose from his stool. Is there anything you're looking for, Domina? Gallia, I told him. She isn't here, he said quietly. Where did she go? He hesitated. With a man. Magister Varius? He looked down at his sandals. I'm a friend, I promised. The boy looked deeply uncomfortable. Yes, he brings her back here before Domina Octavia is ready to go home. Thank you, I said. You won't tell her I told you? Of course not. I walked the short distance to Octavia's villa alone. Inside my chamber, I took out my sketchbook and studied the drawings. The foundling house was my favorite. It was just a plain villa, with a tiled floor and simple mosaics, but it was more important to me than Octavian's mausoleum or the Temple of Apollo. There weren't enough denarii from Alexander's gambling to purchase the tiles for a single floor, and there would never be enough for the rest of a building. But with my finger I traced the balconies where I imagined the children would look out on the city. Some of the slaves who would be crucified at dawn might once have been foundlings. Perhaps they had even been daughters of wealthy patricians who hadn't wanted to provide any more dowries, or sons of merchants who didn't want to feed any more children. I imagined how different life would be for Alexander and me if we had been brought to Rome as slaves, and when Gallia returned with Octavia and the others, I didn't mention her disappearance with Magister Varius. You missed the best part, Alexander exclaimed, bursting into our chambers with Marcellus. What? Another poem about Egypt? Marcellus collapsed on the third couch. No, Maecenas mentioned the red eagle, and my uncle became enraged. Really? I put down my book. What did he do? He wants to set a trap for the rebel, my brother said. But the red eagle's unpredictable, Marcellus said, and never posts in the same place twice. So my uncle is going to have soldiers in plebeian clothes stationed across Rome. And do you think it will work? I asked. If the rebel tries to interfere tomorrow, it may. Marcellus closed his eyes. It's terrible, isn't it? Terrible because you know who the red eagle is? My brother asked. Marcellus opened his eyes. Why would you say such a thing? Because we've heard you leave your room at night, I said, and Marcellus grew pale suddenly. And I saw a shadow move across the garden once. It looked very much like you. We both stared at him. I'm not the red eagle, Marcellus said firmly. How could I ever write such a long acta? I can barely finish my work in the ludus. But perhaps you know him. Or her, I suggested. Marcellus looked from me to my brother. Her? What are the two of you thinking? We were silent for a moment, then Alexander said, Perhaps it's Gallia, and you're aiding her fight. Against slavery? Marcellus's voice was incredulous. Do you really think I'd be helping a rebel? Where else could you have been going? Alexander asked quietly. And Marcellus regained some of his color. To meet someone. A woman? I gasped. He didn't answer my question. Sometimes I pay the guards, but surely you don't think they'd cover for me if they suspected I was a traitor. Alexander and I were both silent. I crossed my arms over my chest, wondering which woman he could be meeting. A Lupa? Julia? Some other pretty girl on the Palatine? Marcellus leaned forward. But do you really think it might be Gallia? By herself, my brother said. It's unlikely, but perhaps she knows someone with access to a great deal of ink and papyrus. Marcellus's eyes widened, and I knew he was recalling the night his uncle had nearly been assassinated, and Antonia had seen Gallia at the bottom of the hill. Not Magister Various. My brother put his finger to his lips. Who else has such resources? Or access to the Palatine, Marcellus realized. He looked at me. Do you think it's him? You say you aren't the Red Eagle. You haven't told us where you've been going. But if we're to believe you, who else could it be? Marcellus sat back against the couch, but didn't rise to my bait. It would make sense, but it could also be 100 other people. Which is why we can't say anything, Alexander said swiftly. You wouldn't turn him in even if you knew, would you? I asked. Marcellus was thoughtful. If I knew for certain who it was, and my uncle came to know. I looked to Alexander. We had been wrong to tell him about Gallia and Various. I won't say anything, Marcellus promised, but it isn't me. When he left, I studied Alexander in the lamplight. Do you believe him? I don't know. I laid down on my couch and looked at the ceiling. So do you think the Red Eagle will save them tomorrow? No. He has every legionary in Rome looking for him. If I were the Red Eagle, I'd disappear for several months. I dressed in the darkness, then crept through the atrium to the dimly lit library before dawn broke across the sky. I could see Vitruvius silhouetted against the lamplight, and with his sharp profile he reminded me of a bird. He looked up from his desk. Have they been killed? I asked him. Vitruvius furrowed his bald brow. Who? The slaves being held in the car, sir. His face became suddenly tender. Executions don't begin until dawn, Celine. But you can be certain that they will die. Those were the orders. From whom? A group of 50 Judases, not one of whom has ever known slavery? How is that fair? Vitruvius nodded slowly. Many things aren't fair. But isn't that what Caesar is for? To make things right? No. Caesar is here to keep the peace. And if 200 slaves have to die in order to keep the peace in Rome, then he is willing to sacrifice them. I stared at him. I don't mean to say that it's my belief, he added, but that is what Caesar is thinking. I took a seat on the opposite side of his desk, but I didn't take out my book of sketches. Do you think the Red Eagle will save them? No, and I wouldn't mention his name in this villa. What began as an annoyance has become a real threat. The boy who was crucified made his attempt in the name of the rebel. You may think this man is brave, Celine. You may even sympathize with those slaves, but do not speak his name around Caesar or his sister. I was disappointed that Vitruvius didn't understand, and when I returned to my chamber an hour later so that Gallia could arrange my hair, I told her what he'd said. He's right. I looked up at her in surprise. No one knows whether that boy was working for the Red Eagle or not. You do, I wanted to say, but I kept my silence until I could know for certain. Besides, if she had wanted to confide in me, she would have. And the 200 slaves? She lowered her head. They were crucified this morning. I gasped. All of them? The smallest children were poisoned. She saw my look in the mirror and stepped in front of me. There is no use in letting this consume you, she warned. You are free, and if you keep away from trouble, perhaps Caesar will return you to Egypt. Then think of the things you could change. I closed my eyes and willed myself not to cry. Instead, I vowed that I would be the most talented apprentice Vitruvius could ever want, and that by my 12th birthday, even Octavian would see that I was useful. All right, guys. That will bring us to a close this evening for our reading. Whew, that was rough. That was rough, to say the least. Is everyone doing okay? Drink your water. Whew, goodness. I hope I didn't lag too much other than that one time. I do wonder why TikTok's doing that these days. Oh, man. All right. Well, hope you guys enjoy the reading. And I hope you guys have a wonderful evening or morning or afternoon, wherever you are. No matter what time of the day it is, or even what day it is at this point, I hope you have a good one, a great one. And Luca, you're welcome, baby. I hope you liked the story. I hope you liked the story. So I will see you guys again on Tuesday, same time, 8 to 9:30 Eastern Standard Time here in the US. Oh, good, good. So yeah, Tuesdays and Fridays. And I will have a great weekend. Hopefully I'm going to get some yard work done if it doesn't rain all weekend, so we'll see. But Cleopatra's Daughter, we got about this much left. So we're definitely more than halfway done. And then when this book is done, we move on to another one of my personal favorites. It's called Leonardo's Swans, and I can't wait for that one, but there's going to be so much more action in this story coming up very, very soon. It really cranks up pretty much from now until the end of this book. So stick around, tell your friends about this, and I will see you guys on Tuesday. Have a good night. I will see you later.